remember at a meeting in Glens Falls with my dad, I was on the couch feeding him. I don't remember. I think I had made dinner for Ethan and I was feeding Jake. And then I don't even want to get too much into it because it's so dark and so horrible, but something went wrong. Like it was just horrid. But I just remember thinking we had each other, we had Ethan, we had support. I mean, it was the first time we talked about some of those things in a decade, like in a very long time. It was really special to be able to reminisce about the good things and the bad things and just know that we're on this journey together, really. It was really special for us. And to really take the time that we took to talk about what is arguably the most important thing in our life, or the most impactful thing in our life, was really awesome. Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. But first, it's time for our review of the week. This review comes from Apple Podcast. After only listening to the 2-minute trailer, I'm already hooked. I can't wait for future episodes of the inspirational podcast to be released. I'm super excited to be getting these reviews. I love it. I hope that people continue to listen. I hope they are hooked, and I hope that it is inspirational. And don't forget to leave a review on whatever platform you are tuning in from. Hello, welcome to A Place of Yes. I'm your host, Heather Straughter. Podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour, and all I can say is I dug deep, figured out where I was and where I wanted to be. And for me, the answer was in a place of yes. Welcome to the show. I'm super excited today because I am here with my hubby, with Brian.
Hi.
Hi. Obviously with Jake's dad, as he's otherwise known. And together we started Jake's Help from Heaven. As we were thinking about this show, I wanted this to sort of go back, all the way back. Let's get right into it. Let's talk about when Jake was born. So can you set the stage for that a little bit? We were obviously living in Boston. Ethan was 15 months old, and we brought Jake home.
It was exciting. Jake, another little Taurus in the house. So Jake was, he was born May 4th. I'm May 7th. Ethan's birthday is January 15th. You're January 3rd. So it was kind of exciting to have, Jake, close to my birthday. And, it was a really exciting time, having, two young boys. You think about all the things that, you're going to do with them as a dad.
Obviously, I know his birthday's May 4th, and I know yours is May 7th, but it's been a long time since I thought about those early days when we really were, when it was like the January and May.
Yeah.
And then I remember fairly vividly and feeling like it was so early on, but that Jake was just obsessed with Ethan. I don't remember as much about what Ethan's initial reactions as having a little brother. Do you remember those?
When I think back at that time, I often go back to when Jake was sick and, Ethan being his big brother, even though he was, 50 months older than him and, still very little. But, he was, always kind of Jake's protector. And, once Jake got sick, he wanted to be involved.
It's funny. I've said this before. I've said it on the podcast, I think, and I just say it a lot in life. Like, our life is in chapters, right? The life of us living in Boston and the life we have now is 27 different lifetimes ago, it feels like. So it's hard sometimes to go back to those days. And sometimes I don't know what I actually remember and what is like I see a picture and I create a memory. I can remember Jake wanting to be like Ethan. And I remember Jake turned over like I think you were at work and I was like, Jake rolled, like much earlier than he should have. Like I want to say it was like 8 weeks. Like he was just a baby and rolled over because Ethan was doing whatever nonsense he was doing as a toddler. And then when we moved even, he sat up early. He was feeding himself early. He was cruising early. I remember those moments. And whether I remember the moments or I look at the pictures and then create the moments, he was so remarkable, right? Like, not to take away what happened when he got sick, but just what a baby.
Yeah, we used to say he's trying to keep up with Ethan, and so what kind of connection did they have at that young age? Where so Ethan was doing something and Jake's all right. Guess what? I'm gonna roll.
Yeah, I'm gonna do it. Like you can't get away from me.
No, and again, it was exciting to kind of see the two of them, bonding.
And you, I remember, would roll your eyes at me when I would say this, and I probably shouldn't even say this, but I'm going to say it anyways.
I never rolled my eyes at you. What are you talking about?
Daily. When we were, they both had the same pediatrician in Boston and subsequently here, but they do those scores, right, when the babies are born, whatever those are called, like APGAR.
Yeah.
Jake's were like through the roof, if you remember. Like
high scoring.
And I remember just like comparing him to Ethan, and you were like, you're not supposed to do that. You shouldn't do that. And I was like, but look at, he's gonna be spectacular. Like, what a baby. And he certainly was and is, just in a very different way, I think, than we thought. But it's so hard for me, even all these years later, to wrap my head around sort of the story of Jake, because I can remember looking at those scores. I can remember talking to you about those scores. I can remember comparing their records in whatever weird way I would. And it's hard to know. So I guess that brings us to the story of 8 months. Although I guess, there's a lot in those first 8 months that we could fill in. We moved from Boston to Saratoga.
Which we, said we weren't going to move until, we wanted to make sure both boys were good, healthy. They met with the pediatrician. We didn't want to move, without everything being perfect, we thought.
Because we had lived so close to Boston Children's. So we were like, if anything's wrong, we'd rather be in Boston than Saratoga.
And who would have thought, we would end up where we did, because it just seems crazy that we thought about it, prepared for it, planned, and then said, "Oh, this is perfect. It's the perfect time to move now."
There's a lot of lessons in there, right? Like, you can't plan anything. No. There's a ton there. But so we moved to Saratoga, and obviously we love to travel now, and it's something that we have done more of. But we traveled to Argentina with 2 babies under 2, and we didn't have seats for them. And then actually, remember, they had to move people who really then loved us, because you couldn't have 2 lap babies under 2 in the same row, remember? So then you went up front with Ethan on your lap. I had Jake on my lap in the last row next to the toilet. Yeah. It just, that seems like a lifetime ago.
It was a lifetime ago, but, we have that picture in our room, where Jake, in our...
Oh, that's a good one.
Like he's on my chest, and, he's wearing a hat.
In the Bjorn.
And... it's kind of crazy because he looked so happy. Life was very good then.
It was. Thought, yeah. So all these things happened in his span of life. And then and I've talked about this on the podcast before, it was Ethan's 2nd birthday. He was so great that day. We had family. Your family was in town. Everyone was in town for Ethan's 2nd birthday. And then that night, we all went to bed. As great as Jake was in so many things, he was not the best sleeper. He was a great eater, great everything, but not the best sleeper. So got up, and it was the twitch.
Yep.
There was the twitch. I sometimes, not as much now as I used to, but what if I did not go crazy about that twitch? What if I just thought, I remember you even kind of thinking like, no, he must just have like a muscle spasm. There was something about it that we just knew was not just put him back to bed.
Well, you put your arm on him, and you're like, I'm trying to hold him, and it's not stopping. It's more.
He couldn't make
it's
it
more
stop.
than just a muscle.
And he was fine though. Like I remember those,
very aware,
very aware. And I think even I gave him a bottle. He took that fine, and then we had people staying with us, so we could go to I was like, I think we need to go to the emergency room. And I remember being like, we can't call anybody, because who am I going to call at 2:00 in the morning and say my son's arm is twitching and have them not think I'm a lunatic?
Yeah.
So we went to the hospital, and that was just a series of misadventures because they didn't have a pediatric person. And even then, though, I remember they were taking x-rays and doing all sorts of things. And he was smiling still. Like, he was such a flirty little boy, and he was flirting with the nurses. But his arm the whole time wouldn't stop. Then the whole thing got pretty dark.
So they said, do you want to go back to, Saratoga Hospital recognized that it was beyond what they knew. So they said, hey, he needs to go to a different medical, facility, a larger one. And, Albany is not an option. So there's Syracuse, New York City, and Boston. And, we came from Boston's Children's Hospital, incredible hospital, for kids. So we said, yeah, we'll go there. You were in the ambulance with Jake. I'm like driving behind you, and the ambulance was kind of just driving at a normal speed. somebody called, either you or somebody on the ambulance, and said, hey, we're going to actually hit our lights, because they were concerned in the ambulance. So they said, don't, try to keep up, because, we need to, get to a hospital. And this is, they were, had already left Saratoga, might have even been outside of New York. So they said, we're going to divert and go to Springfield. Don't keep up. And then we hung up, and I'm like, do you think I'm not going to speed? They diverted and, then took them to Springfield. That's where we feel it kind of got.
Things went south. They didn't know what they were doing. And unlike here, trying to be tactful, they did not acknowledge that they didn't know what to do. Mind you, we are at this point, it's maybe 5 a.m. I mean, our world has turned over in, 4 hours, but this is a small time period. And we went from, 6 hours prior being asleep in our bed with 2 healthy kids to now being in Springfield, Mass. At a hospital with a kid who potentially is dying. We don't know what's happening. And it's one of those moments, like, if I knew then what I know now, I would have handled so much of that so differently. Yes. But the doctor had this idea to treat him with propofol, hopes that it would quiet his brain, figure out what was happening, and kind of, I don't know, almost reset him was kind of the bullshit they told us. And lo and behold, they did that. And I don't remember if we were there a day or two, but it got progressively worse. And I don't remember if it was you or I or a combination of both, but we knew we needed to get him out of there.
I mean, I think we were there a few days.
Was it more?
And then, I think it was 4. And,
4?
4. And then he had, got propofol intoxication.
Yep.
And then they realized, I think, they finally acknowledged they didn't know what they were doing. And, that's when they, med-flighted him to Children's.
And I got on that helicopter. And
Saratoga wanted to get a helicopter.
So that's what I was going to say.
Saratoga tried.
You called my parents.
Yeah.
My parents were about to travel somewhere. They didn't get on their flight. My father was like, if we need to get him somewhere fast, I will pay for it. And we figured out the cost to get a helicopter. That was going to happen, and then the helicopter wouldn't fly because it was too windy.
It was wind, yeah.
I mean, those are those moments, right? Like, what? Why? How is this happening? Like, if we were able to get to Boston that night instead of the layover at Bay State Hospital, things I think would have been different, because it wasn't necessarily just that he was having seizures. It was the way they treated him that subsequently did more damage, I think, than the actual. And who knows? Who knows? We still don't know why that seizure happened. We don't know why. You got to stop asking why, because you're never going to know why.
It didn't help.
It did
None
not
of
help.
that. It didn't.
No. Sometimes when you get mad at the world, I get mad at those things, right? Like, why was it windy? Like, why? I get in the helicopter with Jake. You drive.
I couldn't keep up with the helicopter, but
you made good time, though, if I remember correctly, because I don't feel like I was there that much longer than.
I know how to drive. Push comes to shove, I'll get there.
So you got there. I got there. I remember that feeling when we were at Children's, though, of just feeling like, okay, like my kids, I don't know what it means, but he's going to be okay. Like, I kind of felt like he was in good hands.
He was there 117 days, and, we saw a lot of attendings and residents.
Rotations,
And I kind of, for me, it was like, okay, yes, he's going to be okay. I'd think back, okay, again, thinking of the dad, so he's still going to play Little League. I was thinking, he'll still be playing baseball. But then I was like, what if he's in the outfield and then something happens? Like, if he got a seizure, but no, he's going to be okay. And at one point, I don't know the titles, but there was the one, I'll call him a resident, and he pulled me aside, and he said, this isn't good. This is going to be hard. That was like the first for me, where I said, okay, we got to really, rethink how Jake is and what we need to do for him. Nope, it's not going to be, just normal. There are going to be challenges.
It reminds me, and I'm jumping a little bit, so we'll go back, but I remember when we finally got home, so there were all those moments in the hospital, right, where you're like, okay, he's gonna be better, and we're gonna go, and then at least on my end, you sort of start to realize this was not gonna we weren't just gonna walk out of there. We weren't going back to what we were. But I remember when he started doing like PT, and he was working with Karen and Cynthia, and I can remember being like, okay, great. So when's he going to sit up? Remember, and I remember you and I would go on a walk even and have these conversations a little bit like, well, okay, so now he's in PT 5 days a week. So that probably means he'll be like sitting in in 3 to 6 months. And then maybe he'll be taking steps by the time he's 2.5, kind of still trying to make this a different ending. And I remember it was Karen Dake, and she was like, you have to stop asking me that. You've got to rephrase these questions. Because I was kind of like, you're not giving me an answer. And she's like, because you're asking me the wrong questions. I don't think in that moment it made sense to me, but subsequently it made sense to me. I was like, okay, you're asking the wrong questions. You're not getting the answer you want. So you just keep asking again. But the answer that you want is not coming. So you got to figure out, you got to rewrite the story, and you've got to ask these different questions, and kind of like that, right? Like there was all these moments of when, you get a picture in your head. And I've talked about this. The picture in my head was always that we were going to be on vacation on a beach, and I was going to be walking with my 2 boys. I mean, you've heard me say this
many
million times. It still makes me cry to think that that's never happening. Now Ethan I'm up to his armpits. He is much taller than I am, but I never got that moment, right? And I got all these other great moments and all these other things that happened, but it doesn't make not getting the moments you picture any easier. So we're in the hospital. And I think, so you touched on it. We were there 117 days. At some point, and I don't remember when, we brought Ethan with us, because Ethan at this point he was with my parents. He was in Saratoga, and they would come up and bring him for a day, but bring him back. And then at a certain point, we were like, no, we need our boy with us.
Yeah, we realized we were going to be there for a bit. It wasn't going to just be a short stay at the hospital to figure out what's going on, and they were going to send us back. It was, this was going to be a while. So, Ethan came back. We put him enrolled him in a preschool in Boston.
I always say that thank God we picked Boston, right? And not Syracuse or New York, because, we had moved from Boston. So we had friends. He went to this preschool. He was a kid for I dropped him off, I don't know, at 7:30 or 8 in the morning. And then you often would pick him up. It was the only time he left the hospital was to go pick him up. And at least he was not in the hospital 24/7.
And one of my favorite pictures are, him and Spunky, at the aquarium.
Yeah.
Our friends and family stepped up, to help.
So Ethan and I spent most nights at the Holiday Inn, and they did not charge us.
Yep.
So I don't, that time to me was more like the logistics of how all of that played out was more of a fog to me. But
we didn't know how long we were going to be in Boston, at Boston Children's, and early on, I guess I just decided I'm not leaving at night. There's shifts. There's different shifts. There's the A shift, the B shift, the C shift, and the most challenging one is C.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'm going to just stay here and try to pay attention, stay awake, and make sure, because bad things could happen. And we were fortunate because Holiday Inn in Brookline, we didn't know that owner, we didn't know anybody who worked there, but the owner knew of your dad. And the fact that he knew of your dad, he said, I don't want to charge you. Your family's going through enough. So he gave us a free room for the entire time that we were there. I know you and Ethan, would go and have food because we wanted to do something at the hotel. I mean, having a hotel in Brookline, Mass, for 4 months, 117 days to not charge is incredible. And
it was unbelievable. I'm generous of them. Yeah. Terrible time. And to your point, you never left. Like, your only leaving the hospital was when you picked up Ethan. Yeah. And sometimes you guys would go get ice cream or do something. Yeah. And occasionally...
Because you're like, you still have to do stuff with Ethan. And that was right. You were right.
I credit Jake for teaching me and making me a better person. I credit Ethan for letting me figure that out, because in those days, and I'm jumping ahead, but even starting in these days, like, I knew being Jake's mom and Ethan's mom were two different things. And I had to be Ethan's mom. And in order to be Ethan's mom, I had to fake it till I made it. And that started in the hospital.
And we say, a lot of Ethan's compassion right now, when you look at him at 19, he's a compassionate young man. And it's unfortunate that he became that by learning it through these hard lessons.
Yeah, it's at a loss.
It's, trying to figure out, what's not the silver lining, but, the lessons that we learned or what we took out of it, I think,
Well, the gifts. I kind of think of them as the gifts Jake gave us, right? Yeah. He gave us these gifts to be better people. So you would leave sometimes, to spend time with him. And then, but Ethan and I at a certain point, and, he was 2. So all of the things that 2-year-olds are like, he was still. So sometimes he'd be great and just want to be there. And other times he would throw a fit, for lack of a better word, and I'd scoop him up and take him back to the hotel. Yeah. But we'd go back to the hotel, and we would have some sort of an adventure or something, and we would order dinner, because sometimes we ordered out, but most of the time it was just room service. Yeah. And one of my favorite Ethan stories is, all those months later when we finally were home and I was complaining about having to cook dinner and not doing, and he just picked up the phone and was like, chicken tenders, milk, and a glass of wine, because that was often what we ordered. He sort of in his 2-year-old mind believed that you spoke into the phone and then it arrived. And then in the morning I would drop him off. He would hang out with friends and do adventures, and then I would come to the hospital. Yeah. So I always tried to be at the hospital before morning rounds.
Yeah, no, they do rounds, and we try to, participate in those conversations. And it was always hard when, as different people, would take over for a period of time, because you're always then trying to educate them as to what's going on with Jake, because everybody came with a fresh idea.
Yeah.
And, while fresh ideas are often good, it was hard, when there was a fresh idea maybe at each shift.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed much from A to B. And
sometimes I think I would drive you crazy, and even after he was out of the hospital, but I would lock in. Julie Johnson always calls me Dr. Straughter, right? Because I feel like I can do all the research and, I know things. But I would sometimes be like, no, we've already done that. Like, read the file. Like, I just had, and I felt like I had to be, and I still sometimes feel this way about some of our Jake's families and our kids. And I have to settle myself down because I become so vigilant about remembering details that other people, that board members, that other people don't. But I think from those days of just not trust, like after what happened in Bay State, realizing that I can't trust anybody to take care of my kid but myself. I mean, yes, they were the greatest doctors and they obviously know a hell of a lot more than I do. But if they didn't read the file enough, I'd be like, no, last time you gave him Depakote, he reacted like this. Do not give that again, and I just always felt like if I wasn't there, something was going to go so wrong.
Yeah, I mean, very true. I mean, we had our notebooks, and I think even they appreciated it because it was helpful. We were
some
coming.
Appreciated it more than others.
Yeah, but we were trying to do it, in the best interest.
Yes.
Nobody wanted to do anything bad or hurt him. So
117 days were there. So he turned 1. He turned 1 in the hospital.
Yep. They had a little party for him.
He had those great nurses. They made the blankets, and I bought cupcakes and things for everybody, and banners, and that said like "Yay to be one" or something.
Yeah.
And then I do think something sort of shifted, right? Like it was just time to leave. Like and sort of what we were saying earlier, we were not going to leave with a fixed kid. We weren't even going to leave with a very healthy kid. But it reached a point that we could have stayed there forever.
Yep.
At a certain point, we just had to go home.
Yeah, and I remember, I don't know if it was Dr. Yaman who said it, but he was, they said, you want to get out of the hospital. There's germs in hospitals. It was interesting. We took him home, but then every 2 weeks or so, we were right back on the road, just going to have these follow-up visits because they were still trying to figure out what was going on. They were trying to figure out the appropriate medication he should have. So our life just shifted from being in the hospital every day to going back from Saratoga to Boston every 2 weeks.
Yeah. And in the beginning, I remember when you bring home a baby, right? Like when we brought home Ethan, or even when we brought home Jake, when you bring home a healthy baby, right? You're just like, okay, I'm in charge of this human life. Like no one told us what to do, but all of a sudden you come home with a baby and you're like, I got to feed, it's all those stuff. And then I just remember this pit in my stomach, right? Because as parents, most parents figure out what to do. And then all of a sudden I just remember those days were so scary. And sometimes, remember, we'd all sleep together on the pull-out couch. Do you remember?
I do.
Ethan would.
I've forgotten about. Yes.
Yeah, it was the worst night's sleep you could ever imagine. We had this pull-out couch. It was a weird world for Ethan too. He's now back home. He was used to living with mom in a hotel. Like he was used to his normal was weird. Now we're trying to have a normal, but it's still weird. And sometimes it just was scary. Like you didn't want to leave Jake alone. Like we didn't know what to do, right?
Yeah.
So some nights we would just open that couch and we would all pile in.
No, and Jake had his feeding tube that, went up his nose. I forgot he
came home with a feeding tube.
Yeah, and, so we had to be careful because you didn't want to pull that out, which happened. So you would have to get replaced. And I still remember the day when, I took the feeding tube out and Ethan was there.
Yeah.
Ethan was very involved in the care of Jake after leaving the hospital.
They finally cleared him to get all his meals and calories by mouth. I think back to that sometimes because I remember to both of us and to me specifically, I think if I can't feed my kid, I don't know what I can do for him, right? And I think the mother part, I nursed my kids. It's part of what being a mom meant to me for whatever reason at that time. And when he was being fed, through a tube, like it just, nothing against that. Like, but it just, for me, I was like, I have lost so much of what I know being a mother is. And if I can just feed him, if I can make his food, if I can keep him healthy, I'm doing something.
You used to talk about that. I don't know if you know that, but you definitely used to talk about that. I just felt like it was the only thing
I could do, right?
Yeah,
like, and I knew then, like I could, everything needed to be pureed, but I could feed him avocados. I could, I could puree anything. I just, what I mean? Like we just made it. And then he eventually went on keto to control the seizures. But even that, like I'd make him like the keto cheesecake. It was so important to me. And then I remember at the end, sometimes it was hard for him. I always wondered at what point was I being selfish and not, I don't know that we ever talked about this a ton, but there were times at the end, not obviously we didn't know it was the end. Like we didn't know that he was going to die. But I remember being like, am I making him work too hard? Should we just talk about getting like a feeding tube and just take that pressure off of him? Because it got to the point where you had to feed him so delicately sometimes, and we'd fight about
you'd massage
I had this whole thing about like to make him, and then if you didn't do it right, he'd throw up. And then if he threw up, he sometimes threw up his meds. And then there was, it was just so hard. One of the things I always thought about was like, was the feeding selfish? Was it more for me than for him?
He was a baby. I mean, and, his mom is feeding him. I mean, I still feel that there were, opportunities where Jake was aware of some things.
Oh, totally.
And, so he's aware that my mom's feeding me. And, so I think that was important.
I think we tried to give him the opportunity just to be a kid. I think feeding him represented a lot of that, because there wasn't, to your point, you're not taking him to Little League. We're not taking him on bike rides. We're not, some of that stuff wasn't happening.
Yeah.
So I feel like
embrace the stuff that does.
do what you can. Do what you can. So let's jump a little bit. I tell people sometimes, because, people always make comments about how we travel a lot now. And, you guys are always doing something, blah, 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 blah. It is my belief that, at least for me, and I think for us, there was a stretch of time where we could not do that, and I don't even say that like, oh, poor us, we couldn't travel. It was not even a thought process, right? Like it was, our job is taking care of Jake, and they didn't say we couldn't put him on a plane, but he also sometimes had fluid on the brain. Like it was never, didn't seem like it didn't seem like a risk reward thing. It didn't seem like it made sense. So we pretty much limited anything we did to roughly 3 hours. We really, like, our world was we could drive to Boston, we could drive to New York City, we could drive to Lake Placid, and we could drive to Montreal.
Yep, I was going to say Montreal, yeah.
That was what we did, and that was more than enough. Those trips, I think, to our family became important because it broke us of our routine, but it still provided a safe, like we were safe.
We definitely didn't do any traveling, and the fact that we also had to go back to the hospital so often, kind of didn't, lend itself to traveling. So, sometimes we would end up in Boston, for a doctor's visit, but then that's when Plum Island.
Yeah.
And it was kind of nice because then we started creating family memories of this is what we do.
Yeah.
This is what we do, with our family of 4. And then, so, the following year, where are we going to go this summer? Plum Island. And if people want to see us, guess what? They can come to Plum Island. Yeah. For us, it was important to make sure that our family network, was together. And now when people say you travel, I mean, I think, we've gotten to the point where I don't need to buy you something, you buy me something. I'd rather have a memory. Our memories and our travel is the most exciting thing.
And I still, less so now, but still, when we first started doing something, like I remember right after Jake passed, he passed in December, that March we took Ethan to Disney. Because I had always been thinking about how am I going to get my boys to Disney? Just because I grew up a Disney kid. I wanted to go to Disney with Ethan. I think, we talked about, okay, like how, it's going to take us a week or so, but we'll drive to Florida. We had some of those initial conversations. And then it happened and Jake passed and that was our first trip. In that trip, I remember being like, well, it's a weird way, but Jake is kind of with us now, right? He travels with us. And even all these years later, I still sometimes, like, I think about it sort of where we are. I'm like, oh, hey, buddy,
Yep.
Because we weren't going to take him.
And like Ethan would say, well, what? Jake's right there.
I haven't had that conversation with him as a young adult yet, but I look forward to it. He's not hesitant, but he is not overly talkative about Jake yet. Like, he certainly brings it up. I think that I love that he has talked, I don't know to what degree, but with Leah. Like, I love that he has someone that knows about Jake, because I think for a little bit, he just, part of being a kid is you don't necessarily want to be different and having a kid who passed away and having parents who run a foundation and are public about it makes you different. And sometimes he just doesn't want to be different.
Yeah.
I loved when he would do that, right? Like right after Jake passed. And sometimes I remember being like putting him to bed and he would say his prayers, remember his prayers? And he had his little like routine of everything he would say. I'd say something about Jake and he'd be like, he's right there. I'd be like, where? And he'd be like, over there.
You don't see him?
Yeah. I'm like, oh, hey, buddy. Like we'd travel and he'd be like, no, he's over there.
The things that, kids see and believe. And,
Before
for
they're
me,
too embarrassed.
I'm going to hold on to it.
Like kids really do see it. Like if they're open to it because they don't know that other people think it's weird, right? But like we're conditioned to not be that way. But
and definitely not say it.
Yeah, definitely. Like,
not
even
be
if
that
you
way
think it,
or
like,
say it. Yeah.
But like when you're a kid, you don't know that other people think it's weird. So he was very comfortable being like, "Oh no, Jake's still in this room." People often think that we were ready for him passing. Some people think because he was sick that you just assume it, and I don't think there's anything further from the truth. Yes, we knew that he was not healthy, but we had kept him alive. He lived a pretty good life. Like, yes, it was not the life we thought we were having or the life we thought he was going to have.
No, we take him to street walks, the art district, when they would do stuff on Beekman. I mean, it was, we had our life with Jake.
And I think he liked it, I mean, he had his routine and some days were better than others, but he worked hard at, we had Xavier come to the house.
I was going to say, yeah.
He put him on that fire truck. I mean, we just had such a great team. Cynthia, Karen, like just great people. I do always get a little annoyed when people make the assumption that we knew he was going to pass. Because we had even talked about, what kind of car was I going to drive? Because if I was going to have to get a van and I was, I'm a little vain. So I was like, ugh, they're so ugly. I don't want a handicap van. But I had wrapped my head around that I probably would need to. We talked about when he got too heavy, if we needed to get an elevator put in the house. Like we talked about life.
Yeah, for us, it was not a question of, oh, Jake's not going to be with us. It was always, so what do we need to prepare for? Because we assumed he was going to be with us for a very long time.
And sometimes it was even, the concern was, what about when we get old? The concern wasn't necessarily that he was going to pass away before us. I've been looking for pictures and I've been sort of in this little bit of a rabbit hole of like doing things. And I yesterday spent a good portion of time in my head thinking about the months, right? So I found these pictures of the Halloween, and you probably, without me saying it, I don't know that you'd remember it was his last Halloween, but it was that Halloween when he was the vampire, and my mom did the face makeup, and Ethan was running around with the sword.
I have a lot of pictures as well, in case you're looking for something.
I was looking through, those days leading up, and then I could remember when the days were hard, right? And it wasn't so much, the seizures were under control. We had taken him off some of his meds, so he was a lot more alert. And I remember we were so happy because he was more participatory in his own life. He cried. Remember, we were outside once and he like cried, and we were like, felt like crazy parents because we're like, yay, he's crying.
He's having an emotion. Oh, he's feeling something.
He wasn't drugged. Like I was like, he's pissed off, but I'd rather be pissed off than just the medicine being so high. So we were kind of in this great space. Like he was doing well in his therapies. But then in the middle of the night, he rolled over. This still can bring me right to like where I want to throw up. But his bones were so fragile from all the meds and from whatever genetic issue he had that he broke his femur just in bed. I mean, all of a sudden he's screaming bloody murder. We realized something was going on with Jake because he was screaming and crying and very atypical. Yeah. I think you took him to Albany Med and they set his leg. They said, we need to get him casted. And we were going to take him to his orthopedist. So we got him set, got him comfortable, drove to Boston. I'm calling Dr. Grodkow. He's like, you have to go in through the ER. I will get you. And meanwhile, he's chief of staff of pediatric orthopedics. He finishes his day, and then he came and casted him himself. I think of the people that we surrounded Jake with and we surrounded ourselves with, and I just think of how amazing that was. That happened. We brought him home. And because I'm dramatic, I sometimes think that was like the beginning of the end, right? Because Jake was so much more aware those last few months. But I also think with that awareness, I used to say, I remember talking to Heath Ames about it being like, I almost feel like he's depressed because I think we gave him awareness and I think he realized life was hard. We brought him home. He was comfortable. We had those Christmas pictures with Ethan and Serena. Like he was very participatory in those days. But then you were at a meeting in Glens Falls with my dad. I was on the couch,
Yep.
feeding him. Ethan, I don't remember. I think I had made dinner for Ethan and I was feeding Jake. And then I don't even want to get too much into it because it's so dark and so horrible, but something went wrong. He threw up a little bit, but it was not, it was just, I mean, I've said it to you before. I was like, oh my God, I think it's death. Like it was just horrid. And I screamed at Ethan to call 911, which he did. And 5 years old. And then everyone showed up. Then the ambulance, the neighbors, everybody. And then we were off. I remember they wouldn't let me get in the ambulance. I had a ride in the police car and I was kind of like, what the? But then we got to the hospital and Todd was there. So Ethan's, at the time, very good friend's father was the ER doctor.
Yeah.
And he was fantastic. He was like, let her in here, get her in here. And I think he fought hard. You and my dad got there. I don't know where my mom was.
I believe your mom was there. But I believe Todd, they were waiting for us to get there before they pronounced, that Jake had passed.
Well, I knew because, then he said, are you Catholic? And I said, yes. And then the priest came.
Yeah.
Which, if you're not Catholic, but when you're Catholic, when the priest comes, it's not, you're not getting out of that one. So that was certainly a heavy episode to record, and I imagine to listen to as well. Well, we talk about Jake all the time. We don't talk about really the story of Jake, as I call it. And that was, I think, really cathartic for us to be able to go back to our life as a family of four and really talk about all the ups and downs. And for me, it was really so incredible to listen to him talk about the things he lost too, because I think a lot about the things that I lost. But to realize he never got to take Jake to Little League. It's my story of never walking in the sand with a boy in each hand. I really enjoyed the conversation with him, even though it was about the hardest thing in our life. Next week, we are going to explore more of the story of Jake and how it affected our relationship. They say that a lot of relationships don't do well with this kind of loss. And for us, we really have found that it drew us together. So you'll be hearing more about that. And you'll be hearing about how we turned really our grief into good and how Jake's Help from Heaven came to be a thing. And you'll learn more about our story and why we do the things we do. I hope you'll come back and listen to it. The episode is going to pick back up with us together at the hospital waiting to hear from the doctors.